Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film The Road to El Dorado from 2000. The main reason I'm reviewing The Road to El Dorado is because I reviewed all of the Bing Crosby, Bob Hope road movies, and I wanted to review this and Ishtar, which are two more well-known films influenced by the road movies. And obviously this one maybe is a little more direct in its title, and it's also a film that I've gotten a lot of requests for in the comments ever since I did the Road series, so without further ado, I am now reviewing it. The Road to El Dorado is a early film for DreamWorks Animation. It's actually their third animated film. It came out in 2000, which was the same year they put out Chicken Run, which might be like literally the best year they've ever had, because I can't think of them putting out two good movies in a row like The Road to El Dorado and Chicken Run for the rest of their existence. I mean, that's pretty good. Although, I mean, I like How to Train Your Dragon and Rise of the Guardians and certain things, but to have two big classic animated films in one year is pretty amazing. And they were kind of trying to find their voice. When Shrek hit, that kind of like changed everything for them, and that kind of became the de facto DreamWorks style. They've stopped doing traditionally animated films. They made two more after this, but they have since abandoned the style and just gone with more CG type films. But The Road to El Dorado reflects that time when they were really going for it, when they were almost over animating because they were overzealous and really had something to prove. And I really like that about Road to El Dorado. I like when an animation studio really feels nervous and it feels like they have something to prove, because you get kind of better animated films and sometimes riskier ones just because they're trying to push the envelope to make a name for themselves. Now, this wasn't as big of a priority for them as Prince of Egypt or Ants or Chicken Run, which was Aardman, but they just helped put out, and Shrek. This was kind of a lower priority, but since they were still new and trying to combat Disney, they still cared a lot and put a lot of effort into it. I had never seen this movie before, and what I was struck by is how fun this movie is. This is a very watchable movie. It's written by the same guys who wrote Aladdin. It has like fun flow to it. Aladdin might not be the best film of the Disney Renaissance, but it's the film I ended up watching a lot as a kid because it's fun, it's very watchable, it feels light, it feels digestible, and Road to El Dorado has that going on throughout it. The chemistry between Kevin Kline and Kenneth Branagh very much reminds me of what it was like to watch a road movie. It's a good time at the movies that you can go to and you know it has the reliable entertainment value to it. And The Road to El Dorado has that going on all throughout it. I was swept up in their adventure and their fun, and then their smart alecky back and forth. A lot of people compare this to kind of more fun live action films like that. I've heard of fan castings like Robert Downey Jr. or Neil Patrick Harris. These are people who have won you over through performances and won you over because they're so likable. And I'm not trying to give too much credit to fan casting, but the reason they cast those people in a fan casting of this, which never existed, but I am actually talking about the movie here and reviewing it, is that these guys are incredibly likable. This is a very fun, likable, enjoyable movie, and smart alecky in more of the fun pop culture way and less of the annoying pop culture way, which they would do a year later with Shrek. In Road to El Dorado, this is very universal. It didn't feel like a film from 2000. I've seen animated films and films in general from 2000, and they don't feel this universal and fun. And I almost had to kind of remind myself, other than the animation, the flow of it felt universal in that classic, wonderful Hollywood way, with some Warner Brothers slapstick mixed in with too much complicated animation reminding me of the classic Disney films. Road to El Dorado really swept me up and gave me a good time, just like a fun, classic Hollywood road movie would, and it was a really enjoyable road to go down. In Spain, in 1519, two con artists, Tulio, voiced by Kevin Kline, and Miguel, voiced by Kenneth Branagh, win a map in a fixed dice game to the city of gold, El Dorado. They try to chase after them in a really well-animated, wonderful chase scene and jump into two barrels and end up on a ship, the ship of Cortez, who's voiced by Jim Cummings, who is going to the New World, but then they are first locked up and told they're going to be enslaved in Cuba, but then escape with a horse and actually end up on the edge of Mexico and find themselves in the right place to go to El Dorado, follow the map that they won before, take the horse, and find the city of El Dorado. And when they get to the city of El Dorado, everyone thinks that they are legendary gods who it has been prophesied will come back one day, and they live it up as gods as there is arguing between the chief and the high priestess over whether they are real or not and what they can and can't do, and they try to push the con as far as they can so they can hopefully leave and get lots of gold and hopefully be even even richer than the King of Spain. I actually really like the animation in this, and it reminds me of the Prince of Egypt, but I think this is kind of an odd thing to say, I guess, but I kind of like that this wasn't a high priority for the studio. I think it works for it, because Prince of Egypt, it's like someone when they try too hard and you're like, okay, calm down, like chill out, dude, you're doing it too much. And Prince of Egypt, with its ridiculous voice cast and its amazing animation and stuff, this film has such a great flow to it. Honestly, after watching it for a first time, I was like, I would watch this again. Like, if this was on TV and I was bored, I would be like, you know what, I'm gonna watch Road to El Dorado, fuck it. And like, I totally get why people are obsessed with this movie. It's so fun to watch. Out of all the early DreamWorks films, I mean, Chicken Run is a film I watched several times, and I feel like this as well, they kind of lend themselves to rewatching just because you know what you're getting and you know you're gonna have a good time. And I think with that kind of style of animation, it feels more precious. It does feel like classic Disney, and it's kind of interesting that after having two big, massive projects like Ants and Prince of Egypt, they did something like this, which was not financially successful. It wasn't a huge bomb, I will say that. It like got close to making a profit. It didn't though, but it got close to making a profit. So I know a lot of people act like it didn't do well. It made like 78 against a 90 million budget, but you know, if you count in advertising and things like that. But I'm sure it probably technically made money because of, I guess, pay-per-view at the time and like DVD and VHS and things. They were fine, but it is considered the first DreamWorks movie to lose money, and the only one I read on the Wikipedia, but I feel like that's probably not true at this point. No offense, DreamWorks. What was it, Turbo? This is not as big of a bomb as Turbo. I think the reason it's lived on, because if you do own it, you probably would watch it again. It is kind of a favorite, and that does reflect the Road movies. I mean, people kept rewatching those in theaters, and although this kind of overemphasizes the El Dorado part and underemphasizes the Road 2 part, if you look at the poster, it's like real small. It's like The Road 2. El Dorado! You could honestly think this movie was called El Dorado, and I actually took this out of the library, and I couldn't find it because I was looking for The Road 2, and I eventually went, wait, El Dorado? Oh, The Road 2. Oh, maybe they released it that way. I've seen posters and thought it's a different movie. Although they do it in the Lion King way with like the and the Lion King, they do the same font. This is very much in that style, but it's not an actual tribute. Like, they're not like overemphasizing the Road 2 influence, but it's there. There's a part in the only song they sing in this film that apparently it makes them look like Bing Crosby and Bob Hope. I don't actually think they're those personalities. I didn't actually see that. I did notice they do kind of a similar thing to the patty cake thing from the Road movies, which was interesting, and I feel like that's a reference only I got probably from watching all those Road movies and then watching the Road to El Dorado. They were probably better at doing that kind of a film than Ishtar, because Ishtar was kind of a mess. But this, it got almost the kind of vibe that those films got, because if the Road 2 films, and there was Tumblr at the time and history was completely different, made no sense or something, there would be gifs of Bob Hope doing things like we have gifs of jokes from the Road to El Dorado. It would be a part of that. People did see those movies actually in theaters several times. Like the Road to Morocco played in theaters for like years and years. This film obviously wasn't successful, but the idea that people would rewatch and became a favorite because of its rewatchability, it almost like got the vibe to it. Kevin Kline and Kenneth Branagh gave such good performances, and that the people loved watching it. Like, let's see a movie and forget about our troubles, which this film definitely helps. You know, you don't have the greatest day at work and you watch Road to El Dorado and you feel like your chips are back in or something. One of the interesting things about how they recorded voices in this, and it seems to be, I've been reading various different versions of it, and maybe I could have watched behind the scenes thing, but I didn't. Kevin Kline and Kenneth Branagh recorded their voices together. It is very different. Most animated films, particularly big budget animated films, do record everyone separately, with the exception of certain films and certain TV shows do that, but most of them, like even the Ninja Turtles actually did it all together, but most of them do it separately. That's more common. It depends on the show. But the reason Kevin Kline and Kenneth Branagh have such great chemistry in this film is because of that. They have a natural chemistry. It jumps off the screen, but it's pretty clear that not everyone was recorded together. I think Rosie Perez came in and did some sessions with them, and there's certain scenes you can kind of tell, but I might be guessing on that end. The only scenes you can definitely tell is them together, and in some cases the other voice actors, particularly like Jim Cummings, feels like he's kind of a traditional voice actor at the time, and they stick out. It's like, if you've ever seen a film like Public Enemy with James Cagney is a good example, where you have a different acting style than everyone else in the film, they stick out and you as an audience follow them. It's actually very smart and very interesting, because it's almost setting it up like this is a different, more interesting person. If they're more energetic than anyone else, if they're playing it more off the cuff and improving, and you can sense that, you're going going to understand that they're more energetic and have more personality than everyone else. It's really, really smart. I don't think anyone sets out to do it as much, but Kevin Kline and Kenneth Branagh did it so well. I think it's probably one of the best pairings I've heard in an animated film, probably of all time. But particularly Kevin Kline is amazing in this movie. It's probably one of my more favorite Kenneth Branagh performances, and I think that guy's a pretentious piece of shit. So I was surprised I liked Kenneth Branagh as much as I did, but I liked him and Kevin Kline a lot in this movie, but particularly Kevin Kline, who it's interesting would go on to do Bob's Burgers, where they usually record everybody at once. So big budget DreamWorks movie, which very much feels like a Disney film in terms of how it was made and such. Even having the Elton John songs, which obviously you'd think that it would have been a bigger deal because of The Lion King, but I didn't really like any of the songs in this. They're not very memorable. It's not as memorable as The Lion King. They kind of like wash over you. I wasn't singing any of them. It's like El Dorado. I get that one, but everything else I like totally forget. And it's not like that's a great song. It felt like he wrote them years before and made millions of dollars, but like kind of didn't really give a shit as much, because it's like, what the fuck is DreamWorks at the time, probably. I mean, I can imagine Elton John saying that. They weren't as good. They're kind of like the weakest part of the movie, certainly, is the Elton John songs. I particularly like how the adult humor in this isn't overbearing, because they didn't just have like lame kind of jokes like, oh, only the adults will get it. When Shell, I believe her name is, voiced by Rosie Perez and Tulo get up, it was pretty clear they're doing something that you don't really expect from most big budget animated films, and they always kind of like allude to other things going on, and pretty blatantly, but not like overly blatantly. Like if you were a kid, I don't think you would get it whatsoever. It's not something that would become as blatant as you'd get from the later DreamWorks stuff, where they would really like push it over your head that like, hey, this is a joke for the adults, which would always end up being pretty annoying in the end. I liked how they did it more in this film, because it came off a lot more genuine, and it actually came off a lot more adult than the jokes that are trying to be more adult in those other movies. I think The Road to El Dorado is an interesting kind of weird sidestep in DreamWorks' history, at least thus far, considering it was at a time when they were actually making traditionally animated films, and they actually kind of like really cared about this animation, overdid it quite a bit. It reminds me of the Prince of Egypt animation. Part of me thinks it's interesting because like Kevin Kline and Kenneth Branagh aren't exactly star voices, and it's probably one of the few times they've used a voice cast that doesn't involve a major box office star. That's kind of like one of the things they really like, until like you get into the How to Train Your Dragons and things like that. They usually have people who are a little more commercial, and Kenneth Branagh and Kevin Kline weren't exactly huge stars in 2000. It kind of reminds me more of kind of how Pixar casts and DreamWorks casts. This would probably be one of the few DreamWorks films I wouldn't be surprised if you actually thought it was a Disney film, because that's more representative of the way they do things. But I did really enjoy The Road to El Dorado, and it really has that kind of fun, entertaining, classic Hollywood sense to it, that kind of classic Hollywood humor that was universal but adult somehow, that would seemingly work to everyone but still have the cunning bite of comedy. And it had kind of that slapstick Warner Brothers style that you don't really see from a lot of animated films. None of them really do them quite as well. A lot of people throw that influence out there in interviews and such, but I rarely see slapstick work as well in an animated film as it did in Road to El Dorado. It has a certain wit to it, but also has a very great sense of lowbrow. It's kind of like that highbrow, lowbrow element that kind of works really well together. But I do think the kind of end, kind of conclusion of the whole thing, or the third act, if you will, it does feel like this movie has a higher emphasis on them conning the city of El Dorado than it actually does building to the conclusion of this movie, which has this big monster and everything. It kind of just feels like your typical like big Hollywood movie. I wasn't as into that, but it still had all the fun of the earlier parts, so I kind of just like went along with it. It didn't feel like the story was really traditionally like actually building to that. It just felt like something they threw in to be more exactly like the film that everyone thought they should be, or at least the studio thought they should be, even though this film is kind of not that kind of film. It's kind of a different kind of studio animated film. That's probably the reason the songs are in there, and probably the weaker parts from this film kind of feels like it should be a certain type of film. I've heard the complaints from the Nostalgia Critic and other reviews who've said they don't like how the style of animation and the comedy, they don't feel like that mixes as well. For me, it really does. I really love the comedy, and I like the slapstick and the road to witticism that goes on throughout it. I think it makes for a really enjoyable, fun movie, and it lives up to the tradition of those movies. If you ask me, I think this lives up to it better than probably the later Road movies and Ishtar as well, and actually gives the Road films a really distinct legacy to live on with such a quality animated film like this. I wish DreamWorks animated films would make more films like this, which was more about personality of the characters. That's something live action can do a lot better than animation. Frankly, you see a lot better examples of that, but this is a film that's 100% about these characters characters and why you love Kevin Kline and Kenneth Branagh and want to quote them as much. This is a really fun, really enjoyable movie, and I'm really happy and glad I got to experience it and finally watch it. And it's even more fun, to be honest, if you know the Road movies. But even if you haven't, I think Road to El Dorado is kind of a sidestep in animation history, but it's a sidestep that's a lot better than the main staircase of the rest of DreamWorks animated films. So if you have seen The Road to El Dorado and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.